Greetings from Tokyo, my dear friends. This is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would like to continue on with the viewer questions that you very kindly sent in a few months back. And so I would like to turn to those because they're really excellent, and you have such a great scope and command and a great sense of cinema, and your questions are making me so inspired, and I'm learning from you every single day. So thank you so very much for being my teachers. And so I really want to once again just say how much I'm very much appreciative of your kindness and your continuing to teach me about this great topic, which is cinema. And so in this spirit, let us now go to the next question, which is from Kobe Fan2. So hello, Kobe Fan2. It's nice to see you. And you say, Daisuke, I am curious as to what your thoughts are on remakes and reboots. Do you have any favorite remakes, reboots, and are there any you dislike? Are there any movies, franchises that have not had a reboot or remake that you would like to see remade? Thank you. That is a very fascinating set of questions, all with a particular theme or linked by perhaps what could be said as being one central theme, which is the concept of remakes, reboots. And I want to say from the start, I understand, at least my understanding is that there are similarities, but there are also distinctions that can be made between what the concept or what the definition of reboot is and what the definition of remake is. And I think even in the context or discussion of what those definitions are, I think there are some possibilities and maybe different takes or interpretations. So that's my way of trying to open the conversation. In other words, I want to acknowledge from the outset that I think that it is it is a very complex issue and a very fascinating one in that way. So thank you very much for this great set of questions, Kobe Fan2. I very much appreciate it. Truly, I do. So my general thoughts about, let's say, remakes in general. I have nothing inherently against the remake. I think that the idea of remakes in cinema is something that is very much akin or similar to, say, for instance, the means or ways in which, for example, works in the theater or in performance are performed. So, for example, if we have a written text of a play that is written and designed to be performed by a group of, say, actors or a production group, and then staged and stage managed, etc., with sets and decor and stage direction and actors on stage giving dialogue. This is very much like a production using an underlying source material and, in a sense, remaking that particular idea. And we call it, production of a particular work of art in theater. And depending on one's perspective, one might prefer, say, a production from this year, from this location, from this group of actors and this production group. One might prefer this production versus that production or that production. In other words, this brings about the possibility of different interpretations, different takes, different styles, different motifs that are entered into the equation. The same is true for musical productions, the same is true for opera, who's the performer, who is the actor, who is that person on stage that is giving the particular nuance or inflection or other type of performance value that is captured in that particular performance. And indeed, it's not just the gathering of a particular group of performers or actors, but also it might depend on a particular performance. Maybe within the same group, this performance on this given date and time had a certain value that is different than, say, the performance that was given on the next day by the same actors, by the same production, but it was just, for some reason, the performance value was somehow different from one performance on one day versus another performance on another day. So I bring this up because I find that the concept of remakes in cinema to be similar. I know it's not quite the same, but it's similar in that we have the concept of some kind of underlying source material. Now, where it's generated from, that becomes a different question in itself, but if we're talking about the underlying source material, then we have the source material itself, and somehow that is being interpreted in some way in different, say, iterations or different what we call remakes. And sometimes it's one, sometimes it's more. It depends on the source material itself. And so I think that concept, again, it's not a perfect comparison, I know, because actually there are some differences. There are some really key differences, I think. But as a general approach to, say, interpretations of underlying source material, I bring up this comparison. And in that way, my friends, I think that the concept of remakes in cinema, I think is one that I don't close the door on. On the contrary, I'm very much open to what new possibilities of interpretations might be out there in the realm of cinema. Now, does that mean that I will like all remakes that I see? No, right? There are, of course, films that I don't like that are remakes. But that is true for films in general. It's not just exclusive to the realm of remakes, of course. So, but my point is, so the concept of remakes is something I'm okay with. It's not just I'm okay. I'm very much open to that. And then ultimately depends on what the final end product is and how much I am able to engage with it or not as a viewer with a subjective viewpoint. So that is my general statement on how I feel about remakes. And I feel the same way about reboots as well. I know that there are some differences, actually some quite important differences between the two concepts. And it also depends on how it's defined as well. And so that brings me to another point that I want to mention, which is how to define the concept of remakes in cinema. Because I think this comparison that I was trying to bring up with theater and music performance in terms of the idea of the repeating action or the revisiting of certain source material and giving a different or possibly or potentially giving a different interpretation to an underlying source material. That is the concept that I think is similar. However, then we have to go to the underlying source material point or issue. And so in the concept of remakes, what's interesting, and I think what certain differences can emerge between, say, theater and cinema, at least in this very, say, structured way of providing this comparison or metaphor, is it's the idea of the underlying source material, what it is, and whether or not the underlying source material was designed inherently from its genesis to be something that would be adapted in, say, a performance form or a remake form in cinema. And so that's where I understand some of the differences emerge. In other words, with a remake, what you have is sometimes, not always, but you have an underlying film that was made in a certain point in time, and then by a certain group of filmmakers or production companies or producers, and then a certain group of, say, actors or performers on camera. And then some time later, in a subsequent point in time, you have maybe the same actors or the same performers, the same filmmakers, the same producers, but sometimes they can be different. but there is the idea of taking the concept from that particular film and then using that concept as a basis for creating, say, a new script, or combining or gathering new actors in a scenario that would be based on a script that itself was based on the story that was presented in the film, right? So what's interesting, we're not talking about a script that is well, actually, let me take a step back. What we are talking about, therefore, is the possibility of what is the link between, say, the original underlying work and then the source material, or not, sorry, what is the link between the original underlying work and then the remake? Was the script written as a means to remake is it the same script as the underlying film? In which case that could be said to be a remake of the earlier underlying film because the script is the same. That's one possibility. Or was the script for the new film, was it rewritten, or was it written from wholly fresh cloth, as it were? Was it written from the very beginning? And that writing act itself is done, or it was created based upon the writer or screenwriter's concept or idea of what the original film was. And so there we have, I think, a very interesting relationship between what the underlying source material was and then what the remake is, because the link becomes the script was created based on the scriptwriter's concept of what the earlier film was. So there we have, therefore, a remake based on an interpretation that has, arguably speaking, not this direct link in terms of the same text being used. And so that's where I think some of the differences begin to emerge between, say, a remake of this sort in cinema and, say, the idea of putting on a production of a play whose text is constant from production to production to production. And so already we have certain variables, not as many constants, but certain variables that emerge in this process, potentially anyway. Now, that's not to say that there are no constants whatsoever. In other words, there might be some lines of consistency that could be established. Of course, there's the idea of some kind of story thread being the same. Maybe the certain character names might be the same. In some cases, maybe some actors who appeared in the earlier remake might appear some actors who appeared in the earlier film, might appear in the remake, maybe in the same role, maybe in a different role, who knows. But in any event, we have this connection that is established. And also sometimes, too, there can be some interesting folds of complexity, because the idea of a remake inherently brings about with it the idea that we have different continuity lines. In other words, the continuity is not the same. This is not a film and sequel relationship. This is a film and remake relationship. And the remake, therefore, inherently suggests a different continuity. However, sometimes there might be examples of remakes where it is ultimately revealed that it is not quite only a remake, but it's also a sequel, because the continuity is revealed to be maybe the same as the earlier films. Case in point, well, I'll bring it up later. But so, in other words, there can be many different possibilities and many different categories or subcategories that can emerge. So this is where I think part of the complexity arises with the concept of remakes. Another issue is what, therefore, is the underlying source material. Oftentimes in the discussion of remakes, and I too am engaged in this, oftentimes one is considering, say, a film from an earlier period and then the film that is emerging in a later point in time. So the later point film is a remake of the earlier point film. However, that's not always the end of the story, because what is also a possibility is not only do you have the remake, not only do you have the earlier film, but perhaps the earlier film was based on a, say, short story, and maybe the short story was then adapted to make this first film. And then we have a film that comes later. Now, is the film that comes later, is this a remake of the earlier film, or could it be said, perhaps from a different point of view, to be, say, another new adaptation of the underlying short story? So it's not quite a remake as much as it is a new adaptation of the underlying short. So we have different alternative, adaptations of a similar or the same underlying short story. And I think an example of that, where the discussion can go in many different ways in this avenue, is the film The Thing, and the relationship between the thing and the thing from another world, and also the relationship between the thing and the underlying work. Who goes there? And so, are we talking about remakes, or are we talking about different interpretations of the underlying text material? And so, I think that's where we can have a discussion of what the meaning is of remakes, and how I think ultimately, depending on the context or the particular films we're talking about, it can really change. And so, and then we were thinking, and then if that's the case, then what does that mean in terms of how we view the relationship between the two films? If it's not necessarily a remake relationship, then how do we see these films? I'll bring up The Thing as an example. So how do we see these films in relationship to each other? Do we have to see a relationship to each other, or can we see them as separate things? If we see a relationship, what is it? Is it, and so I find those questions to be very fascinating indeed. So this is, again, my very crudely put way to say that I don't close the door on remakes, but I acknowledge that it can be very fun and it's one where you can have different variations possibly. And so that kind of discussion and trying to figure out what those specificities are, I think, is part of the fun of that conversation. Now, the same is true for reboots too. I don't close the door on reboots, but I understand, and again, maybe my understanding is not wholly correct here, but my understanding is, while there are similarities, there are also differences between what a reboot is and what a remake is. Because I think the idea of reboot, the reason why the word reboot is used is we have some kind of earlier, say, film series, what's oftentimes referred to as a film franchise, but it will take a series of films. It means film, and then we have a sequel, and maybe sometimes another sequel and a sequel, and we call a series of films. And then what happens maybe later is we have this series that forms the basis of, say, an endeavor to want to have the same series or run of films, but with a maybe new set of characters or new actors or new filmmakers, etc. So the story is the same, but one needs to, say, reestablish or establish a new continuity timeline in order to then have, from that point, a jumping off point or a reboot of new films in this, say, new continuity or this new series. And so that's what I understand the reboot concept to be. So I think the reboot is tied to the idea of a film series. So and again, I think along with the idea of remakes, there can be a lot of complexities with that, because are we talking about timelines that are wholly separate from each other, or are there in fact crossovers? And do those crossovers really make sense in the strict sense of the term continuity, or does it really matter? I mean, is it a more meta type of conversation? And those sorts of points can be very fun and very intriguing. Case in point, something that comes to mind immediately for me is for instance, the Casino Royale film, the James Bond film with Daniel Craig, and how that is oftentimes regarded as a type of reboot, because it seems to be an origin story about the start of James Bond. And if that's the case, that is, of course, setting a new continuity timeline from what we understand was established from the earlier James Bond films with Dr. No and beyond. And so, therefore, the film Casino Royale is considered to be a reboot. and therefore the films that emerge after that are in the same continuity timeline of this reboot universe. So therefore we have two different timelines or two different lines of continuity. However, sometimes in those films, the Daniel Craig films will get references to the past films that were in the other continuity. And so references made to, say, the Aston Martin or something. So this is very, I think, an interesting thing that it does. It doesn't do it all the time, but there are points sometimes, arguably, where you have the rules of continuity, different continuity, and exceptions to those rules. And so I think that type of say, continuing discussion between what is what came earlier and what is now currently undergoing, I think it's a very fascinating discussion to witness as a consumer and viewer and watcher of these films. So that is a general type of discussion, if you will, on my viewpoint on remakes and reboots as a general proposition in cinema. So I have to apologize, because I do appreciate too that it's really quite a complex issue. And we also have to recall and remember that ultimately it is about the film and how we see the film. Sometimes we might not engage with the film as much as we would, say, the earlier films. And that's very fair. That's very valid. Sometimes we might think that, oh, this new film brings a different interpretation. Oh, it's great. And that's very fair too. Again, it ultimately depends on how you view the film and how you view the end product. And also it means too that one doesn't have to be open to the idea of remakes or reboots. One might feel that the original series or the original film was the best. And so if that's the case, that's, I think, that's a very reasonable and legitimate viewpoint to have. Again, it depends on your point of view and how you look at it. And also, it's also not just subjective, or part of it too is part of this. Well, I should correct myself and say that I also acknowledge too that part of the subjective process, or part of the process of whether or not one engages with the film or not, is how one feels about how the underlying material or story or characters, how they are being treated in this new interpretation or new remake or reboot. I find that also to be a very, very much a very relevant and a very relevant conversation. In other words, is the source material being handled or treated in a way that might be seen to be consistent and respectful with the underlying in this new remake or reboot fashion? Or is it being treated in a way that might seem wholly and perhaps cynically seen as being like a marketing gimmick or cash grab? Or is it something of a hybrid? Again, it really depends on the particular subject or the particular end product film. And so I think and also it depends on how much you view, say, the earlier underlying works versus how you view the interpretation or the remake or reboot. And so I understand wholly that it is a very complex subject matter, and one that is subject matter or field of discussion, one that is very much ongoing, and it depends on the field, the films that we're talking about. So. But in any event, taking into account the possibility of those complexities, I still have a general approach that I'm of course very open to the concept, but ultimately it depends on what the end product film is. So in that sense, what are some examples? And so I think, for instance, maybe one film that I admit I have some trouble engaging with, or I'm not so much engaged with, is, say, the Nightmare on Elm Street remake. I find that to be a little bit difficult for me to engage with, and I maybe say that because I have a really strong fondness for the earlier films. So that's one example. Now, another example is maybe the Suspiria film. I am a big fan of Luca Guadagnino's work, Suspiria. And also, I am a big fan of Dario Argento's work, Suspiria. And so I find those films, I have an unshakable love for the Dario Argento work. I think that is a masterpiece. And I continue to be dazzled by that film. I've seen it so many times, and I'm just in awe of that film every single time. And now I look at Guadagnino's work, Suspiria, and I am also right. I use the word dazzling here too. I'm dazzled in a different way, in a way that is different. Much like, right, Suspiria, Dario Argento's Suspiria is different than Guadagnino's Suspiria, and so which is better? For me, that's not the point. The point is they take me in different places, and so I am very much. I love the approach that Guadagnino took and company took for that film, and I continue to be mesmerized by that work. At the same time, my love and admiration for Argento's work remains unshakable. So that's an example, I think, of when where the quote-unquote remake and the original work, the relationship between the two is very fascinating. And so I think that's an example that sticks out in my mind right now. And then finally, to answer your last question, are there any movies, franchises that have not had a reboot yet that I'd like to see remade? I admit that's one where it's a little bit difficult for me to answer, and it's not. I hope you're not offended by that. But I think it's a great question. But again, I'm not so well equipped to be able to answer that, simply because maybe my reach of imagination is not so strong. So I can't think offhand what an example would be of a film that I really like, or a film that I'd like to see remade or maybe rebooted or something. So I can't quite envision that. Again, I apologize for not being able to answer that question, but in other words, let me return to this point, and then I'll end here, which is that again, I think it's the concept is very much consistent with approaches to art and adaptation, and then ultimately, right, just with any film or just with any work, ultimately it comes down to whether we like it or not, for whatever reasons that we might have at that given point in time. Okay, so Kobe Fan2, thank you so much for the great questions, and for anyone who is out there, or Kobe Fan2, how would you answer your questions here? I'd love to hear your responses, and also for anyone who might be interested, I'd love to hear how you would respond to these great questions from our dear friend. So please let me know in the comment section below. Okay, so that's it for now, and so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.